It was late into the night when Theo heard the knock, a sharp, relentless sound that shattered the stillness of Bazutha community. He opened the door to find his sister Mabel standing there, her face streaked with tears. "They want to take everything from me," she sobbed, clutching her silk scarf tightly. Theo hesitated, his instincts warning him to tread carefully. For years, Mabel's life had revolved around luxury, yet her cries tonight felt different. "What happened, Mabel?" he asked, his voice steady but curious. "They think I don't deserve anything. After all the sacrifices we've made for this family, they want to leave me with nothing," she exclaimed. Little did Theo know, this was the beginning of a web of greed and deception that would unravel their family's legacy. The next morning, Theo sat on the edge of his worn-out couch, turning the events of the night over in his mind. Mabel had always been dramatic, but something about her desperation felt heavier this time. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When he opened it, his elder brother James stood there, his face tight with frustration. "She's at it again, Theo," James said without preamble, holding up a glittering golden bracelet. "She left this in Dad's hospital room," James continued, shaking his head. "Said it's a token of appreciation. But we all know it's her way of worming into his good books before the will is finalized." Theo frowned, his stomach twisting. "Do you really think she'd—" "Theo, she's capable of anything when it comes to money," James said firmly. "And if we don't stand our ground, she'll bleed us dry." Theo stared at the bracelet, its shine mocking the loyalty that had once bound their family together. He realized that whatever Mabel was planning, it wouldn't end with a simple trinket. James wasn't wrong. Over the years, Mabel's demands had grown more frequent, each one wrapped in a veil of entitlement. Theo found himself transported back to their childhood, when their mother passed away unexpectedly, leaving their father to raise them alone. Back then, Mabel had been the apple of everyone's eye, a lively girl with a smile that could soften even the hardest heart. But as they grew older, her charm turned into manipulation. She never lifted a finger to help with chores or their father's business, instead basking in the privileges their family's sacrifices provided. Theo shook his head, pushing the memories aside. He needed to focus on the present. His father was still recovering in the hospital, and the family's estate was on the line. Later that evening, Mabel's voice echoed through the compound, laced with feigned innocence. "I'm only asking for what's fair. Don't I deserve the same security as you two?" But James's voice cut through her theatrics like a blade. "Fair? You've taken more than your share already. This isn't about fairness, it's about greed." The tension was palpable, and Theo knew that something had to give. But as the night wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. "Call it greed if you want, James, but I've earned my place in this family." Mabel's voice rang through the house, a mix of defiance and desperation. Theo watched from the sidelines, his father's frail figure resting on the hospital bed in the corner of the room. Their father, Mr. Wilson, once a strong and imposing man, was now a shadow of his former self. Yet his sharp eyes betrayed that his mind was still intact. "Enough." Mr. Wilson's voice, though weak, silenced the argument. He coughed lightly and gestured for them to come closer. "This family has survived on unity, but I see it slipping through my fingers." Theo stepped forward cautiously. "Dad, we're just trying to ensure everything is done fairly." "And fairness means Mabel is left with nothing?" Mabel interjected, her eyes wide with indignation. Mr. Wilson sighed. "The house will be sold, and the money will be divided equally among all of you." His tone left no room for argument. "It's time for all of you to stand on your own feet. No more handouts." Mabel's face twisted in disbelief. "You can't mean that, Father. You know I don't have the means to." "You've had every opportunity, Mabel," Mr. Wilson said firmly. "It's time for you to create your own path." As the siblings left the hospital, Theo couldn't shake the feeling that this decision would only fan the flames of Mabel's anger. 2 days later, Theo was jolted awake by a call from James. "Theo, you need to come to the family compound now," James said, his voice strained. When Theo arrived, he found James pacing the living room, clutching a folded piece of paper. "What's going on?" Theo asked. James handed him the letter. As Theo read, his stomach churned. It was a legal notice, accusing James and Mr. Wilson of withholding Mabel's rightful inheritance and threatening to press charges if she wasn't given the second house outright. "This has to be a mistake," Theo said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "No mistake," James said bitterly. "She's playing dirty now." The weight of the situation sank in. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a battle for their integrity. And Theo knew that if they didn't act quickly, Mabel's actions could destroy everything their father had worked so hard to build. By the next morning, the news of Mabel's legal threat had spread through the community like wildfire. At the local market, whispers followed Theo and James wherever they went. "I heard Mabel's brothers are trying to cheat her out of her share," one vendor said. "Didn't they say she was their father's favorite? How did it come to this?" Another replied. Theo clenched his jaw as he picked up supplies for their father. Every glance felt like judgment, and every murmur stung like a blade. James was less patient. "If Mabel wants a fight, she'll get one," he said later that evening. "I'll hire a lawyer and make sure she doesn't see a cent more than she deserves." Theo placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let's not make this uglier than it already is. There has to be a way to settle this without dragging the family name through the mud." But James shook his head. "You're too soft, Theo. She's not the little girl we grew up with anymore. She's ruthless, and if we don't push back, she'll take everything." As the brothers argued, Mabel was busy spinning her own version of events. She visited neighbors, friends, and even distant relatives, painting herself as the victim of a greedy, ungrateful family. The more she spoke, the more sympathy she gained, and the more isolated Theo and James became. That night, Mr. Wilson called Theo to his bedside. The old man looked even weaker than before, his face pale and drawn. "Theo," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "this family is falling apart, and I fear I don't have much time left to fix it." Theo sat down, his heart heavy. "Dad, we're trying, but Mabel won't listen. She's not the same person anymore." Mr. Wilson closed his eyes, as though the weight of the truth was too much to bear. "I spoiled her," he admitted after a long pause. "I gave her everything, thinking it would make her happy. But I see now that I failed her. I didn't teach her the value of hard work or family." Theo felt a lump in his throat. For all his father's flaws, the man had always acted out of love. "What do you want us to do, Dad?" Mr. Wilson opened his eyes, his gaze piercing. "Fight for what's right, but don't lose yourselves in the process. Family is worth more than any amount of money or property. If there's even a chance to save this bond, take it." Theo nodded, though he wasn't sure how to make peace with someone who thrived on chaos. The following day, Theo visited Mabel at her home. He found her lounging on a plush couch, her phone in hand. The walls were adorned with expensive decorations, a stark contrast to the modest upbringing they'd all shared. "I hope you're here to talk sense into James," Mabel said, barely looking up. "No, I'm here to talk sense into you," Theo replied, his voice calm but firm. "This path you're on, it won't end well, for you or for us." Mabel raised an eyebrow. "So now I'm the villain? After everything I've sacrificed for this family?" Theo blinked in disbelief. "Sacrificed? Mabel, you've been given more than any of us. Dad and James worked their hands raw to provide for you. And now you're threatening to destroy them." Her expression hardened. "I'm only asking for what's mine. If you can't see that, then maybe we're done here." Theo sighed. "Think about what Dad would want, Mabel. This family doesn't need more division." But as he walked out of her house, he couldn't help but feel that his words had fallen on deaf ears. Days passed, and Mabel's silence spoke louder than words. Theo tried to focus on caring for their father, but the tension hung over the family like a storm cloud. Then, one afternoon, a courier arrived at the family compound with an envelope addressed to James and Theo. "What now?" James muttered as he tore it open. His face turned red as he read the contents. "She's officially filed a legal claim for the second house. She's demanding immediate ownership or she'll take us to court." Theo's stomach dropped. "What's her basis for the claim?" James shoved the papers toward him. "She's saying that since Dad gave her the first house outright, it proves his intent to provide for her more than us. She's calling us jealous and claiming we're trying to cut her out of the family legacy." Theo sighed deeply. James, this is getting out of control. If we let this go to court, it'll ruin us all. Dad's reputation, the business, it's not worth it. James slammed his fist on the table. So what do you suggest? Give her everything she wants? Let her walk all over us like she always has? Before Theo could respond, a knock interrupted them. Mabel stood in the doorway, her face a mask of false calm. I see you got my letter, she said coolly. Theo stepped forward, his voice tight. Mabel, why are you doing this? You already have so much. What more do you want? What I deserve, she replied, folding her arms. I gave up my youth for this family. Now it's my turn to live comfortably. Gave up your youth? James said, his voice rising. You've done nothing but take, Mabel. We sacrificed our futures so you could have yours. Mabel's eyes narrowed. You have until the end of the month to give me the house. Otherwise, I'll make sure you regret it. As the weeks went on, the family feud spilled into the community. Neighbors and friends chose sides, with some defending Mabel and others siding with Theo and James. She's just standing up for herself, one woman said at the marketplace. Her brothers think they can control everything just because they're men. But look at how much they've done for her, another countered. She's acting like they owe her the world. The gossip reached Mabel's ears, and she used it to her advantage. She began hosting small gatherings at her home, spinning tales of her brother's so-called betrayal. They think I'm weak because I'm a woman, she told her guests, tears glistening in her eyes. But I won't let them push me around. Meanwhile, Theo and James worked tirelessly to shield their father from the stress. But Mr. Wilson could see the cracks forming in his family, and it broke his heart. One evening, as Theo sat by his father's bedside, Mr. Wilson grasped his hand. Promise me something, he said weakly. Anything, Dad, Theo replied. Don't let this fight destroy you and James, Mr. Wilson said. Your bond is more important than any house or money. And if Mabel won't see reason, then let her go. Theo nodded, though his heart ached. He didn't know how to let go of a sister who had once meant so much to him. The day after Mr. Wilson's plea, Theo gathered his thoughts and called James to join him in the study. The room, filled with the scent of old books and their father's presence, had always been a place of calm. But today, it felt like a battleground. We need to make a decision, Theo began, his tone measured but firm. Dad's health is getting worse, and this fight is tearing us apart. James leaned against the bookshelf, arms crossed. So what's your plan? Give Mabel the house? Let her win after everything we've done for her? No, Theo said firmly. But we need to approach this differently. Fighting her in court will only drag this out and hurt all of us, including Dad. We need to find a way to cut ties without ruining what's left of this family. James raised an eyebrow. Cut ties? Are you suggesting we let her go and leave us behind? I'm suggesting we give her what she wants, but on our terms, Theo said. If we sell the house and give her the money, she won't have a claim to anything else. It's a compromise that could bring this nightmare to an end. James stared at him, disbelief etched on his face. And what happens when she squanders it and comes back for more? Theo met his gaze. We make it clear this is the last straw. No more handouts, no more sacrifices. If she chooses to burn bridges after this, that's on her. After a long silence, James sighed heavily. Fine. But if this backfires, don't expect me to forgive her, or you. Later that evening, the brothers invited Mabel to the family home for a final discussion. She arrived wearing an air of smug confidence, as if she'd already won. So, have you come to your senses? She asked, settling into the chair opposite them. Theo took a deep breath. We've decided to sell the second house. After clearing any debts, the remaining money will be split equally among the three of us. Mabel's smile faltered for a moment. Sell it? That's not what I asked for. It's the best solution, Theo said calmly. This way, everyone gets their fair share, and we can move forward without further conflict. Mabel leaned back, her expression unreadable. Fair share? You mean a watered-down version of what's rightfully mine? James bristled but held his tongue. Theo pressed on. Take it or leave it, Mabel. This is the only offer you're going to get. For a moment, It seemed like she might refuse. But then her lips curved into a sly smile. "Fine," she said. "As long as I get my share, I don't care what you do with the house." The house was sold within weeks, and the proceeds were divided as promised. Mabel received her share, which was more money than she'd ever had at once. She flaunted her newfound wealth, buying expensive clothes and throwing lavish parties to prove her success to the community. But her victory came at a cost. The distance between her and her brothers became a chasm. For James, the sale of the house marked the end of his relationship with Mabel. He refused to speak to her, even when they crossed paths in town. Theo, on the other hand, couldn't let go entirely. He kept hoping she would come to her senses and realize the damage she'd caused. But every time he reached out, she brushed him off, too caught up in her new lifestyle to care. Mr. Wilson, though relieved to see the conflict resolved, grew quieter with each passing day. His health continued to decline, and it became clear that the family had lost something far more valuable than property, their unity. Months passed, and Mabel's life of luxury began to show cracks. While she basked in the attention of her newfound social circle, she failed to notice how quickly her fortune was dwindling. Lavish parties, designer clothes, and impulsive purchases left her with little to fall back on. One evening, as she sat in her now sparsely furnished house, reality hit her hard. The bank had sent multiple notices regarding overdue payments, and her friends, once eager to celebrate her success, had begun to drift away. Meanwhile, at the family home, Theo and James were busy rebuilding their lives. They'd reinvested their portion of the money into their father's business, which was finally starting to stabilize. Though the house sale still weighed heavily on them, they found solace in their work and each other. Their father, however, grew more frail. Mr. Wilson often sat on the porch, staring into the distance, his once lively eyes now clouded with sadness. "Theo," he said one day, his voice barely a whisper, "I wish I'd done things differently. Perhaps I was too lenient with Mabel." Theo placed a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. "You did what you thought was best, Dad. None of this is your fault." But deep down, Theo couldn't shake the feeling that their family's bond was slipping further out of reach. One rainy afternoon, Mabel showed up unannounced at the family home. Her appearance was a far cry from the confident woman who had demanded the house. Her once pristine clothes were wrinkled, and her face was etched with worry. Theo opened the door, surprised to see her. "Mabel, what are you doing here?" She hesitated, looking past him into the warm, familiar home she'd once taken for granted. I need help," she said quietly. James, hearing her voice, walked into the room. His expression hardened the moment he saw her. "What do you want now, Mabel? More money? Another house?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "I've made mistakes. Big ones. And now, I have nothing left." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, they saw the weight of her choices reflected in her eyes. Theo stepped forward, his heart torn. "Mabel, we tried to warn you. We wanted to help you, but you wouldn't listen." "I know," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I was selfish and ungrateful. I hurt all of you, and I don't expect forgiveness. But please, I don't know where else to turn." James crossed his arms, unmoved. "You think you can just walk back into our lives after everything you've done? Dad nearly broke himself trying to keep this family together, and you threw it all away for what?" Mabel fell to her knees, sobbing. "I don't deserve your help, but I'm begging you. Please, just give me one more chance." Theo looked at James, whose jaw was clenched with anger. He knew his brother had every right to shut the door on her. But something in Mabel's broken demeanor made him pause. "Let's talk to Dad," Theo finally said. "He deserves to decide." Mabel sat on the worn couch in the living room, her eyes swollen from crying. The air in the room was heavy with unspoken tension. Theo and James guided their father into the room, his frail body supported by their steady hands. Mr. Wilson's face, lined with years of wisdom and weariness, showed no emotion as he took his seat. "Mabel," he began softly, his voice raspy but steady, "why have you come back?" She knelt before him, clasping her trembling hands together. "Father, I've lost everything. The money, the friends. It's all gone. I let my greed destroy the bond we had, and I don't know how to fix it." James leaned against the wall, arms crossed, glaring at her. "You're only here because you've hit rock bottom. If things were still good for you, we wouldn't even see your shadow." Mabel flinched at his words, but she didn't argue. "You're right, James. I was selfish. I was wrong. But I'm here now because I want to make things right. If you'll let me." Mr. Wilson sighed deeply, his frail hands trembling as he held the walking stick across his lap. "You hurt this family, Mabel. You tore apart the foundation your brothers and I worked so hard to build. Do you understand the pain you've caused?" "I do," she whispered, tears falling freely. "And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make amends." Theo glanced at James, whose hardened expression betrayed a flicker of hesitation. "Dad," Theo said carefully, "what do you think we should do?" Mr. Wilson closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on his shoulders. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm yet laced with sorrow. "Mabel, you are my daughter, and no matter what you've done, I cannot turn you away. But if you want to stay, you must earn your place in this family again. You will work alongside your brothers, contribute to the household, and prove that you've truly changed. This is your last chance." Mabel moved back into the family home under strict conditions. For the first time in her life, she found herself waking up early to help with chores, learning the basics of their father's business, and assisting Theo and James in their daily tasks. At first, her efforts were clumsy. She spilled water while cleaning, miscalculated figures in the business ledger, and struggled to keep up with the physical demands of the work. James watched her with skepticism, always quick to point out her mistakes. "This isn't a free pass, Mabel," he reminded her one evening. "We're not going to pick up your slack if you fall behind." "I'm not asking you to," she replied, her tone devoid of the arrogance it once held. "I'll learn, even if it takes me longer than you'd like." Theo, ever the peacemaker, quietly encouraged her when James's frustration boiled over. "She's trying, James," he said one day after Mabel had left the room. "It might not be enough for you yet, but she's putting in the effort." Their father, too, observed her progress with cautious hope. Though he rarely spoke about it, the faint smile on his face when Mabel successfully balanced the books or cooked a decent meal spoke volumes. As the weeks turned into months, Mabel began to find her rhythm. She started contributing ideas to improve the business, some of which surprised her brothers with their practicality. She spent quiet evenings listening to their father's stories, asking him about the challenges he faced in his younger days. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Mabel hesitated before speaking. "I know it might not mean much now," she said, looking down at her plate, "but I'm sorry. For everything. I know I've hurt all of you, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it." James stared at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "It's going to take more than words, Mabel. But you're doing better than I expected." Theo smiled faintly, sensing a small crack in James's armor. Their father nodded approvingly, his heart lightened by the gradual restoration of their family bond. While there was still a long road ahead, the seeds of redemption had been planted. For the first time in years, hope began to bloom. Months passed, and Mabel's transformation appeared genuine. Her brothers, particularly Theo, started to lower their guard, believing her efforts were heartfelt. Even James, the most skeptical of the family, began to soften. But deep within Mabel, old desires festered like embers waiting to reignite. One evening, as she sat in the family study pretending to reconcile the business accounts, she stumbled upon an old ledger. Her eyes widened when she noticed records of a hidden bank account their father had kept over the years, a rainy day fund that no one else seemed to know about. Her mind raced. "Why should I settle for crumbs when the family is sitting on a gold mine?" she thought. The quiet humility she had displayed for months was merely a mask, a role she had mastered to regain access to the family's resources. The next morning, Mabel's demeanor shifted subtly, though no one noticed. She began to ask probing questions under the guise of helping the family. "Theo, have you ever thought about expanding the business?" she asked casually over breakfast. "There must be money set aside for growth, right?" Theo shrugged. "Dad's always been cautious about big risks. We use what we earn, and any extra stays in savings for emergencies." Mabel nodded thoughtfully, concealing her growing excitement. "Savings for emergencies, or savings for me?" Over the next few weeks, She plotted meticulously. Mabel forged signatures, transferred small amounts of money to herself from the family's accounts, and began creating false expenses to cover her tracks. To everyone else, she appeared hardworking and dedicated, but in reality, she was siphoning funds at every opportunity. James started noticing discrepancies in the business finances. "Theo, have you checked these accounts recently?" he asked one evening, holding up the latest ledger. "Something doesn't add up." Theo frowned, examining the records. "That's strange. Mabel's been handling this part lately. Maybe she made a mistake." James's eyes narrowed. Or maybe she didn't. Despite months of watching her work diligently, James couldn't shake the memory of her past greed. He decided to monitor her closely, but without confronting her just yet. "Let's keep this between us for now," he told Theo. "I want to see what she's really up to." Late one night, Mabel thought the house was asleep as she crept into her father's study to forge another transfer. The sound of the creaky floorboards made her freeze momentarily, but when no one stirred, she continued. As she worked, a shadow appeared behind her. "What are you doing?" James's voice cut through the silence like a knife. Mabel spun around, her face pale. "James." "Hi. I was just checking something for Dad," she stammered, trying to hide the papers in her hands. James stepped closer, his expression cold. "At midnight? With forged documents?" Realizing she'd been caught, Mabel's mask slipped. Her voice hardened. "Fine. You caught me. But what are you going to do about it? Tell Dad? Go ahead. Let's see if he believes his perfect little daughter could do something like this." James clenched his fists, fury burning in his eyes. "You haven't changed at all, have you? This was all just an act." Mabel smirked. "Of course it was. You really think I'd spend my life scrubbing floors and playing housemaid? This family owes me for everything I've been through. I'm just taking what I deserve." The confrontation left James seething, but he didn't act immediately. He knew exposing Mabel would devastate their father, whose health was already fragile. Instead, he confided in Theo, who was equally shocked but agreed to proceed with caution. "What do we do?" Theo asked, pacing the room. "If we confront her openly, Dad will be crushed. And if we let her continue, she'll drain us dry." James sighed. "We need proof, solid proof that she's stealing. Once we have it, we'll make her face the consequences." Together, they devised a plan to track her actions, setting a trap that would reveal her greed in full. A week later, Mabel attempted her boldest move yet, transferring a large sum from the hidden account to one she'd secretly opened. Unbeknownst to her, James and Theo had installed monitoring software on the family's computer. As she hit submit, alarms went off, both figuratively and literally. James and Theo burst into the study, catching her red-handed. "Mabel, it's over," James said firmly, holding up a printout of her fraudulent transactions. "We have everything we need to prove what you've done." For the first time, Mabel looked genuinely panicked. "Wait. Please, I can explain." "There's nothing to explain," Theo interrupted, his voice filled with disappointment. "You've betrayed us again, and this time, you'll face the consequences." Mabel, cornered and desperate, shifted her approach in a heartbeat. She began to cry hysterically, clutching her chest as though she were the victim. "You two are ganging up on me," she wailed, her voice trembling. "How could you accuse your own sister of such horrible things? All I've ever done is try to help this family, and this is how you repay me." James shook his head, unimpressed by her theatrics. "Stop pretending, Mabel. The evidence is clear. You've been stealing from us for months. There's no way out of this." But Mabel wasn't giving up so easily. Her face twisted with anger, and she pointed a trembling finger at her brothers. "If you expose me, I'll destroy you both. Do you think people will believe 2 men over me? I'll tell everyone you've been harassing me, verbally and physically. You know how the world is today. One accusation from me, and your lives will be over." Theo froze, the weight of her words hitting him hard. "You wouldn't dare," Mabel smirked, her tears gone in an instant. "Try me. I'll go to the police, the media, anyone who will listen. I'll make sure you're branded as monsters who tormented their poor, innocent sister." James's jaw tightened, but he refused to back down. "You can try, Mabel, but this time, you've underestimated us. We've been documenting everything. Every forged signature, every stolen penny, every lie you've told, it's all here." He held up a folder filled with evidence. Mabel's confidence wavered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "You think that'll matter? Society is on my side. Women like me are always believed, no matter what. And if you don't hand over that evidence, I'll make your lives a living hell." Her threats were relentless. She accused them of trying to withhold her rightful inheritance, claimed they had verbally abused her for years, and even suggested that they were jealous of her success in life. "You two have always hated me," she sneered. "You couldn't stand that Dad loved me more. This is your pathetic way of trying to ruin me." Theo, visibly shaken, turned to James. "What if she's right? What if no one believes us?" James placed a reassuring hand on his brother's shoulder. "We've done nothing wrong. We have the truth on our side, and we won't let her destroy us with lies. It's time to fight back." Determined to protect their father and preserve their family's legacy, James and Theo took a bold step. They shared the evidence with a trusted lawyer, who advised them to confront Mabel openly in a family meeting with their father present. The gathering was tense. Their father, already weakened by illness, sat silently as James laid out the facts. He detailed every transaction Mabel had made, every document she had forged, and every manipulative lie she had told. Mabel, realizing she was losing control, tried to interrupt. "They're lying, Dad. They've always been against me. They're trying to make me look bad so they can take everything for themselves." James calmly handed their father the folder of evidence. "Read this, Dad. It's all there. Mabel has been stealing from us and threatening to destroy us if we didn't let her get away with it." Their father's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. His face fell as the truth became undeniable. "Mabel, how could you?" he asked, his voice filled with heartbreak. Seeing her father's disappointment, Mabel broke down into another round of crocodile tears. "I was desperate, Dad. You always treated me like I was special, but deep down, I knew I wasn't good enough. I just wanted to secure my future." Her father shook his head. "Securing your future doesn't mean destroying your family. What you've done is unforgivable." True to her word, Mabel didn't go down quietly. She spread false stories about her brothers in the community, accusing them of mistreatment and abuse. Some people believed her, while others sided with the brothers after seeing the evidence. James and Theo stood firm, refusing to let her lies define them. They worked tirelessly to clear their names, sharing their story and exposing Mabel's toxic behavior. "Men must stand up against false accusations," James said during a community meeting. "We cannot allow lies to destroy lives. The truth will always come out." Their courage inspired other men in similar situations to speak up, challenging the societal norm that often left them defenseless against false claims. As Mabel's lies unraveled, her once adoring community began to see her true colors. Friends and acquaintances distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone who had betrayed her family so deeply. Her father, devastated by her actions, made a difficult decision. "Mabel," he said one day, "you've left me no choice. I'm removing your name from the family's assets. You'll need to find your own way in life." Mabel's face crumpled in disbelief. "Dad, please. You can't do this to me." "I've given you everything," he replied, his voice heavy with sorrow. "And you've repaid me with greed and betrayal. It's time for you to take responsibility for your actions." Mabel's life took a drastic turn after her father's decision. Stripped of the family assets and shunned by the community, she found herself facing the consequences of her actions for the first time. One morning, she sat alone in the small room she had rented with the last of her savings. The silence was deafening, and for the first time, the weight of her choices pressed down on her. She tried reaching out to old friends, but they had heard the stories. One after another, they declined her calls, unwilling to associate with someone who had betrayed her family. Even her husband, who had initially stood by her, began to distance himself. "You lied to me too, Mabel," he said one evening, packing his bags. "You told me your brothers were monsters, but it turns out you were the real villain. I can't stay in this mess any longer." Mabel begged him to stay, but he walked out, leaving her truly alone for the first time in her life. Meanwhile, James and Theo were working to rebuild their lives and restore their family's reputation. They held public meetings, inviting community leaders and elders to hear their side of the story. At one such meeting, James stood before the crowd, holding the folder of evidence. "We're not here to seek revenge," he said. "We only want the truth to prevail. This isn't about men versus women, it's about right versus wrong. Let's stop normalizing toxic behaviors, no matter who they come from," James said, his voice steady yet firm. The crowd listened intently, murmuring among themselves. The community elders, who had been skeptical at first, began nodding in agreement as James presented the undeniable evidence of Mabel's schemes. Theo stepped forward, his voice tinged with both pain and determination. "We loved our sister. We sacrificed so much for her, and she repaid us with lies and threats. But we refused to let her lies define us. The truth matters, and it's our duty to fight for it, not just for ourselves, but for anyone who's ever been falsely accused." The elders, moved by their words and the evidence, publicly declared their support for the brothers. "This should serve as a warning," one elder said solemnly. "Lies and greed can destroy families, but truth and integrity will always prevail." The meeting ended with applause for James and Theo, and a renewed sense of justice within the community. Their courage inspired other men who had faced false accusations to come forward and share their stories, creating a ripple effect that challenged societal norms and encouraged honesty and accountability. Back in her lonely room, Mabel seethed with anger and frustration. She couldn't accept that her plans had failed so spectacularly. Desperation led her to hatch one final, reckless scheme. She called her brothers, feigning remorse. "James, Theo," she said in a shaky voice, "I've been thinking about everything I've done, and I realize how wrong I was. I want to make amends. Can we meet and talk?" James, though wary, decided to give her a chance. "We'll meet, Mabel, but know this, there's no room for manipulation or lies anymore. If you're sincere, prove it with your actions." They agreed to meet at a neutral location, a small community hall where the elders had gathered earlier. Mabel arrived, her appearance disheveled and her expression a mixture of guilt and defiance. As the conversation began, it didn't take long for her true intentions to surface. She launched into a tirade, accusing her brothers of ruining her life and demanding a share of the family assets. "You owe me," she shouted, her voice echoing in the hall. Theo stood up, his patience finally worn thin. "We owe you nothing, Mabel. You've taken enough from us, our trust, our peace, and our father's health. This ends now." The confrontation spilled into the open, drawing the attention of passers-by. As a small crowd gathered outside the hall, the community elders intervened. "Let us mediate," one elder said. "This family matter has become a public concern." The elders listened carefully to both sides. Mabel, despite her initial bravado, began to falter under their stern gazes and pointed questions. When asked for evidence to support her accusations, she had none. Her lies crumbled like a house of cards. "Mabel," one elder said firmly, "you've brought shame upon yourself and your family. It's time for you to take responsibility for your actions. Your brothers have shown nothing but love and patience, and you've repaid them with deceit." The verdict was clear. Mabel would no longer have any claim to the family's assets. Instead, she was ordered to apologize publicly and seek professional help to address her toxic behavior. The day of Mabel's public apology arrived, and the community gathered in the village square. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew about Mabel's lies and the hurt she had caused, and they wanted to see if she would finally take responsibility. Mabel stood on the raised platform, her hands trembling as she gripped the edges of the wooden podium. Her brothers, James and Theo, stood a few feet away, their expressions unreadable. She cleared her throat and began, her voice barely audible at first. I want to apologize to my brothers and to this community," she said, pausing as murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I allowed greed, jealousy, and lies to guide my actions. I betrayed the trust of the people who loved me the most." Her words hung in the air, but her tone lacked the sincerity the crowd was hoping for. It wasn't long before people began whispering among themselves, questioning whether she was truly remorseful or simply going through the motions. James stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "Mabel, words mean nothing if they're not backed by actions. Are you ready to truly change, or is this another performance? Mabel froze, her facade crumbling. The weight of her actions finally hit her, and tears streamed down her face. I don't know how to fix what I've done, she admitted, her voice cracking. But I'm willing to try, if you'll give me a chance. The elders intervened, reminding the crowd that change takes time and effort. Mabel has a long journey ahead of her, one elder said. But it's up to her to prove her sincerity through her actions, not just her words. James and Theo, though cautious, agreed to give her an opportunity to make amends. However, they set clear boundaries. Mabel would need to support herself financially, seek therapy, and contribute to the community in meaningful ways. You'll need to earn back our trust, Theo told her firmly. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. Mabel nodded, humbled by their conditions. For the first time, she realized that love and respect couldn't be demanded, they had to be earned. In the months that followed, Mabel faced countless challenges. She struggled to find work, as her reputation had been tarnished, and she often found herself reflecting on the life she had taken for granted. Meanwhile, James and Theo thrived. Their honesty and resilience earned them admiration and support from the community. They expanded their business, using part of their earnings to support charitable causes, including programs to help men and women who had been falsely accused or wronged. The story of their ordeal became a powerful cautionary tale, inspiring others to stand up against lies and manipulation. It wasn't just a victory for the brothers, it was a victory for truth and justice. Mabel sat on the small wooden bench outside the community center, staring at the dusty road ahead. It had been months since her public apology, but the damage she had done wasn't so easily undone. The people still whispered when she walked by. Employers refused to hire her. Even children looked at her with suspicion, as though sensing the darkness she once carried. For the first time in her life, Mabel understood what it meant to be truly alone. She had tried reaching out to James and Theo again, hoping they would let her back into their lives, but they remained firm. If you're serious about changing, prove it, James had told her the last time she visited his shop. We won't carry you anymore, Mabel. You need to stand on your own feet. His words stung, but Mabel knew he was right. Desperation pushed her to seek work outside the village, and after weeks of searching, she found a job as a cleaner in a small town nearby. It was grueling, humiliating work, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, carrying heavy loads. But it was honest work. And for the first time in her life, she was earning her own money. One evening, after an exhausting shift, Mabel sat under a large tree near the market, counting the few bills she had earned that day. It wasn't much, but it was hers. As she sat there, an elderly woman selling fruit nearby struggled to lift a heavy sack onto her cart. Mabel hesitated for a moment, then stood up and walked over. "Let me help," she said, lifting the sack with some effort and placing it securely onto the cart. The woman looked at her in surprise, then smiled. "Thank you, child. Not many stop to help these days." Mabel nodded, but said nothing. She didn't realize it at the time, but that small act of kindness was the first genuine, unselfish thing she had done in a long time. And it felt good. While Mabel struggled to rebuild her life, James and Theo continued to prosper. Their business expanded beyond their village, attracting customers from neighboring towns. One day, as James was overseeing a new shipment of goods, a journalist from the city arrived, asking for an interview. "Your story has inspired many," the journalist said. "False accusations, family betrayals, and resilience in the face of injustice. People need to hear this." James hesitated at first, but Theo encouraged him. "Let's tell our story, not out of revenge, but as a warning and a lesson." The interview aired a week later, and the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from men who had suffered similar betrayals, from families torn apart by greed, and from women who stood against such toxic behaviors. The story sparked a conversation, forcing society to question long-ignored injustices. And in a way, that was the greatest victory of all. Months passed, and Mabel's transformation was slow but real. She no longer schemed or manipulated. She worked hard and kept to herself. But the true test of her change came one evening when she overheard two women gossiping about a young man in the market. "He's a thief," one woman whispered. "I saw him near the fruit stall last night." I heard he assaulted a girl in the next town, the other added. Mabel stiffened. She had lived on both sides of this story, spreading lies and being exposed for them. She took a deep breath and approached the women. Did you actually see him steal? She asked, keeping her voice calm. The women looked startled. Well, no, but then don't accuse him without proof, Mabel said. Spreading falsehoods can ruin lives. The women fell silent, guilt flashing in their eyes. Mabel walked away, her heart pounding. She had spent so long tearing people down. Now, for the first time, she had stood up for the truth. And it felt like redemption. Mabel continued working tirelessly, waking up before dawn and returning home long after sunset. Though she had changed, the scars of her past lingered in the minds of those who knew her. Trust, once broken, was difficult to rebuild. One afternoon, she gathered enough courage to visit her father's grave. Her father died in his sleep after all the stunts she pulled. He was given a befitting burial with family and friends in attendance. She hadn't been there since the burial. As she knelt beside the simple stone marker, tears welled up in her eyes. I was wrong, Papa, she whispered. I took everything you and my brothers gave me for granted. I thought I deserved it all without giving anything back. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to be better. As the wind rustled through the trees, Mabel felt a strange sense of peace. She didn't need words from the dead. What mattered now was what she did with the life she still had. Little did she know, James had been watching from a distance. He had come to visit their father's grave as well, but when he saw Mabel kneeling there, vulnerable and broken, something in him softened. Maybe, just maybe, she truly was changing. The following week, Mabel was cleaning a shop when she heard a familiar voice behind her. You missed a spot. She turned, startled. It was Theo, standing with his arms crossed. Mabel straightened up, uncertain of how to react. What are you doing here? I came to see if you're really doing the hard work or if this is another performance, he said bluntly. Mabel sighed. She had no defense. She had lied so many times before that their skepticism was justified. Without another word, she grabbed the rag and continued scrubbing the floor. If Theo wanted proof, she would show him through actions, not words. He watched for a while, then finally spoke. James saw you at Father's grave. He thinks you might be serious about changing. Mabel's hands froze. Hope flickered inside her, but she didn't dare let it grow too much. I don't deserve their forgiveness, she admitted. Theo sighed. No, you don't. But if you keep this up, maybe one day you will. For the first time in a long time, Mabel felt a small but genuine sense of hope. Weeks passed, and Mabel continued proving herself through her actions. One evening, as she was preparing to leave work, she was surprised to find James waiting outside. He handed her a small envelope. What's this? She asked cautiously. Your share of the inheritance, James said. Father wanted us to divide everything equally, and we will honor that. Mabel's hands trembled as she held the envelope. A year ago, she would have grabbed it greedily, but now. I don't deserve this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James shrugged. Maybe not. But it was never about what you deserved. It's about doing the right thing. Mabel swallowed hard. She had fought so hard for wealth before, hurting everyone in the process. But now, she had finally learned that money meant nothing without respect and love. She held out the envelope. Keep it for now, she said. I need to earn my place in this family again. James looked at her for a long moment before nodding. Maybe you're finally starting to understand. Mabel stood outside James's shop, staring at the wooden sign above the door. It felt strange to be back here, not as someone demanding what wasn't hers, but as someone willing to earn her place. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. James and Theo were at the counter, going through inventory lists. They looked up, surprised to see her. I want to work, Mabel said before they could speak. Not as charity. Not because I expect forgiveness, but because I want to do something meaningful. The silence stretched. Theo raised an eyebrow. You? Work? Mabel nodded. Yes. James leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. You understand this won't be easy? You won't get special treatment. I don't want special treatment, she said firmly. I just want a chance. James and Theo exchanged glances. Then, James picked up a broom and handed it to her. "Start by sweeping the shop." Mabel took the broom without hesitation. She knew this was a test, and for the first time in her life, she was ready to prove herself. Days turned into weeks, and Mabel worked harder than she ever had before. She swept, stocked shelves, and helped customers. She didn't complain, didn't ask for favors, and never once tried to manipulate her way out of a task. At first, Theo kept a close eye on her, waiting for the moment she would slip back into her old ways. But as time passed, he saw something different. She was changing. One evening, after closing the shop, James called her over. "You've done good work," he admitted. "But this isn't just about the shop, Mabel. If you truly want redemption, you need to make things right with the people you've wronged." Mabel swallowed hard. She knew what he meant. Her lies had destroyed reputations, friendships, and trust. It wasn't enough to just work hard. She needed to face those she had hurt. And that terrified her. The next morning, Mabel gathered her courage and visited the village square, where she knew she would find the people she had wronged. The moment she stepped into the marketplace, whispers began. Women nudged each other. Men cast wary glances. She spotted Amina, one of the women she had manipulated into turning against James and Theo. Taking a deep breath, Mabel walked up to her. "Amina, I need to talk to you." Amina crossed her arms. "Why should I listen to you, Mabel? You lied to all of us." "I know," Mabel said, her voice steady. "And I'm sorry. I let my greed and selfishness control me. I hurt you. I hurt everyone. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need to say this. I was wrong." Amina studied her for a long moment. Then, to Mabel's surprise, her expression softened. "We all make mistakes," Amina said. "But not everyone owns up to them." Mabel felt a lump in her throat. It was only one small step, but it meant everything. Mabel walked away from the market with a heavy heart. Facing Amina had been difficult, but she knew it was only the beginning. There were still many people she had to confront. People whose trust she had broken, people who had suffered because of her selfishness. Her next stop was the village elder's home. He had once spoken highly of her family, but after everything she had done, she knew his respect had turned to disappointment. She knocked on the wooden door, her hands trembling. "Come in," came the elder's deep voice. Mabel stepped inside, her eyes lowered. The old man sat on a woven mat, watching her with a gaze that held both wisdom and judgment. "I know why you're here," he said before she could speak. "You want forgiveness." Mabel hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to take responsibility." The elder studied her for a long moment. Then, he nodded slowly. "Taking responsibility is the first step. But true redemption is not about words. It is about what you do next." Mabel swallowed hard. She had come seeking closure, but the elder was right. Words alone would never be enough. She had to prove through her actions that she had truly changed. As Mabel continued making amends, not everyone was willing to accept her change. One afternoon, as she walked through the village, a group of women whispered loudly as she passed. "She thinks working in a shop will erase everything she did," one scoffed. "She lied, threatened, and betrayed her own family," another sneered. "People like her don't change." Mabel kept walking, her face burning. It was painful to hear, but she couldn't blame them. She had spent years lying and manipulating. Why should they believe she was different now? But she refused to let their words shake her. She wasn't doing this for praise. She wasn't doing this to be liked. She was doing this because it was the right thing to do. And no matter how many doubted her, she would keep going. One evening, Mabel was closing the shop when a young girl ran inside, tears streaming down her face. "Please help," the girl cried. "My brother fell into the river." Mabel's heart pounded. The river was deep and dangerous. Many had drowned there before. Without hesitation, she grabbed a lantern and followed the girl, running as fast as her legs could carry her. By the time she reached the riverbank, a small crowd had gathered. The boy was struggling in the water, his arms flailing. Mabel didn't think. She just acted. She tore off her shoes and waded in, fighting against the current. The water was cold, pulling at her with strong waves, but she pushed forward. When she finally reached the boy, he was barely conscious. Grabbing him tightly, she fought her way back to shore. As they stumbled onto the sand, people rushed forward, gasping in shock. "Mabel, you saved him," someone whispered. She sat there, drenched and exhausted, holding the shivering boy in her arms. For the first time in years, the villagers looked at her not with suspicion, but with something else. Something like respect. Mabel had spent her life taking from others, taking love, trust, and kindness without ever giving anything back. But that day at the river changed something. People who had once turned away from her now greeted her. The whispers of doubt were quieter. Even Theo and James, though still cautious, began to treat her as part of the family again. One evening, James called her aside. "You've worked hard," he said, "and I see that you're serious about changing. If you're ready, I think it's time you took your rightful place in the family business." Mabel's breath caught. She had spent so long trying to take what wasn't hers, but now she was being given a chance to earn it. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I won't disappoint you." For the first time in her life, she truly meant it. Mabel's journey wasn't over. Redemption took time. But as she looked at the shop, the family she had nearly destroyed, and the people who were finally beginning to believe in her, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the woman she used to be, and for the first time, that was something to be proud of. Mabel woke up before sunrise, something she had never done willingly before. She had grown used to her new routine, cleaning the shop, stocking shelves, and learning the trade under James's watchful eye. But no matter how much she worked, there were moments when doubt crept in. Would people ever truly forgive her? That morning, as she swept the storefront, she noticed a familiar figure standing across the road. Linda, one of the women she had once convinced to spread false rumors about Theo. Mabel hesitated, then took a deep breath and walked over. "Linda," she said cautiously. Linda turned, her expression unreadable. "Mabel." There was a long silence before Mabel spoke again. "I know I don't deserve kindness, but I want to make things right. What I did to Theo, what I did to all of you, I was wrong." Linda studied her carefully. "People can change, Mabel. But you have to understand, some wounds take longer to heal." Mabel nodded. "I understand." Linda didn't say anything else, but she didn't walk away either. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. And Mabel would take it. Just as Mabel was beginning to believe she had a chance at a fresh start, trouble came knocking. One afternoon, a group of men entered the shop, strangers from another village. They looked rough, their clothes worn, their eyes sharp. James straightened. "Can I help you?" The tallest man smirked. "We're here for Mabel." Mabel's blood ran cold. James's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "She owes us," another man sneered. "Debts don't disappear just because someone changes." Mabel's hands clenched. She had forgotten about them, the men she had borrowed money from when she was desperate to maintain her old lavish lifestyle. Theo stepped forward. "Mabel doesn't owe you anything." "Oh, but she does," the tall man said, stepping closer. "And if she can't pay, we'll take what's ours." James glanced at Mabel. "Is this true?" Mabel swallowed. She could lie, like she always had. She could pretend she didn't know these men. But she had promised herself, no more lies. "It's true," she admitted. "I made mistakes. But I won't run from them anymore." The men laughed. "Good. Then we'll expect payment soon." As they walked out, Theo turned to her, his expression unreadable. Mabel knew what he was thinking. No matter how much she tried to change, her past wasn't done with her yet. Mabel knew she couldn't ask James or Theo for help. This was her mess, and she had to fix it herself. That night, she went to the market, searching for work that would pay quickly. She found a woman selling handmade baskets and asked if she could help. The woman eyed her skeptically. "You? Work? I've heard about you, Mabel." Mabel met her gaze. "Then you know I need to make amends." The woman sighed. "Fine. But I won't pay you until the baskets are sold." Mabel nodded. She sat down and began weaving, her fingers fumbling at first. But as the hours passed, she found a rhythm. She worked through the night, her hands sore, her back aching. By morning, she had finished 10 baskets. It wasn't enough to clear her debt, but it was a start. And for the first time, Mabel wasn't trying to take shortcuts. She was willing to fight for her future. Mabel carried the 10 baskets to the market, exhaustion weighing her down. She had never worked this hard for anything in her life, but she was determined to prove, to herself and to everyone else, that she had truly changed. She approached the basket vendor with hope. "I finished them," she said, setting them down carefully. The vendor inspected them, nodding in approval. "You're learning," she said. "But these won't sell for much. People prefer baskets made by trusted hands." Mabel's stomach tightened. "I just need enough to clear my debt." The vendor sighed. "I'll sell them, but you won't get paid until they're bought." Mabel swallowed her disappointment. She had no choice but to wait. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of Theo in the crowd. He was watching her, his arms crossed. "You're really doing this?" he asked. Mabel nodded. "I have to." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, he gestured to the baskets. "How much?" She blinked. "What? How much do you need?" Mabel hesitated. Accepting help was what got her into this mess in the first place. But this wasn't a gift. Theo was offering to buy them. 5 silver coins, she admitted. Theo pulled out his pouch and handed her the money. "I don't trust you yet, Mabel, but I respect effort." Tears burned at the back of her eyes as she took the coins. "Thank you." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. Mabel rushed to the village outskirts where the debt collectors were waiting. She handed the coins over, relief washing through her. "It's not the full amount," the tall man said, counting the coins. "But we'll take it for now." Mabel exhaled, thinking she was free. But then, the man smirked. "You see, Mabel, we liked doing business with you. How about another deal?" Her stomach twisted. "No, I'm done with all that." His smirk widened. "Are you?" "Because if you don't, we might have to tell people about, well, everything you've done. And I don't think Theo would like hearing more of your secrets." Mabel's hands clenched into fists. They were trying to trap her again. "No," she said firmly. "I won't let you control me anymore." The tall man stepped closer, his voice a whisper. "Then let's see how long your new friends stand by you when they know the whole truth." Mabel knew what he meant. There were still things she hadn't confessed. Things that could ruin everything. As she walked back into the village, her heart pounded. Would Theo, James, and the others still believe she had changed if they knew everything? Or would they turn their backs on her forever? Mabel sat in her small hut, staring at the floor. She could lie, hide her past like she always had. But if she did, she would never truly be free. The next morning, she walked to the shop where James and Theo were working. They looked up as she entered, sensing something was wrong. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice shaking. James folded his arms. "Go on." Mabel took a deep breath. "I didn't just owe them money. I worked with them. I helped them cheat people, manipulate deals. I did terrible things." Silence filled the shop. Theo's jaw tightened. "And now they're threatening you?" Mabel nodded. James exhaled, rubbing his temples. "You should have told us sooner." Mabel lowered her head. "I was afraid." Theo studied her carefully. "Do you regret it?" Tears welled in her eyes. Every single day. For a long time, no one spoke. Then, to her shock, James placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll deal with it." Mabel looked up, disbelief in her eyes. "You still trust me?" James gave a small, tired smile. "Trust? No. But I believe you're trying. And that's worth something." Theo nodded. "But if they come back, we fight back." Mabel felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Mabel had expected relief after confessing, but instead, fear settled in her chest. She had made many enemies, and the men she owed were not the type to let things go. That night, as she lay on her small mat, a sharp knock echoed through her hut. She froze. Another knock, louder this time. Mabel's hands trembled as she lit a lamp. She slowly approached the door, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she whispered. Silence. Then, a voice she knew all too well. "Open up, Mabel. We need to talk." It was the tall debt collector, the one who had threatened her. Mabel hesitated, then took a deep breath and opened the door just enough to see his face. His cold, calculating eyes studied her. "You made a mistake," he said. "You should have taken our offer." Mabel's grip tightened on the door. "I told you, I'm done with that life." The man chuckled. "You think the village will still accept you if they know everything? If I tell them how you tricked widows out of their land? How you faked illness to get money?" Mabel's throat went dry. She had hoped those secrets would stay buried. "What do you want?" she whispered. He smiled. "Simple. You either work for us again, or we make sure you lose everything. Even your new friends." Mabel clenched her jaw. "No." His smile faded. "Wrong answer." He turned and walked away, leaving her in the cold night air. Mabel shut the door, her body shaking. She had chosen her side. Now, she had to be ready for war. The next morning, Mabel rushed to James's shop. She found him and Theo already at work. "They came to my hut last night," she blurted out. James put down his hammer. "Who?" "The debt collectors. They're going to ruin me." Theo frowned. "What did they say?" Mabel swallowed hard. "They know my past. They said if I don't work for them again, they'll tell everyone the worst things I've done." James sighed. "So they're playing mind games." "They don't need to," Mabel muttered. "If people hear the truth, I'll lose whatever little trust I've gained." Theo leaned against the workbench. "You already confessed to us. If you really want to be free, tell the whole village before they do." Mabel's stomach twisted. "You don't understand. If I admit everything, they'll never accept me." James crossed his arms. "If you don't, you'll always be running from your past." Mabel lowered her gaze. Could she really do it? Could she stand before everyone and reveal the worst parts of herself? She had fought so hard to rebuild her life. Now, she had to decide if she was brave enough to destroy what was left, before her enemies did it for her. The village square was buzzing with activity when Mabel stepped onto the wooden platform where elders made announcements. She took a deep breath, forcing her legs to stop trembling. James and Theo stood nearby, watching. Mabel cleared her throat. "I need to speak." The crowd fell silent. People turned to face her, whispering among themselves. "I haven't been honest with all of you," she began. "Many of you know I was once greedy and selfish. But there are things I've done that you don't know." Mabel inhaled sharply. "I lied to people for money. I cheated, I manipulated, and I took advantage of others. And now, the same people I worked with want me to go back to that life." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some people looked shocked. Others nodded as if they had always suspected. "I don't expect forgiveness," Mabel continued. "But I want you to hear the truth from me, not from my enemies." An older woman stepped forward. "And why should we believe you now?" Mabel met her gaze. "Because I have nothing left to lose." The woman studied her for a long moment. Then, she turned to the crowd. "We all make mistakes. But I'd rather trust someone who admits their sins than someone who hides them." Some villagers nodded. Others still looked doubtful. Mabel knew she hadn't won everyone over. But she had done something more important. She had taken away her enemy's power. Mabel had expected relief after confessing, but instead, the fear of what would come next gnawed at her. The debt collectors wouldn't just walk away. They had too much to lose. That night, she sat with James and Theo by the fire outside James's shop. The flames flickered in the cool night breeze, casting long shadows on their faces. "They won't stop," Mabel murmured. "They're going to come for me." Theo leaned forward. "Then we need to be ready." James nodded. "We need proof of their crimes. If we can expose them, they won't be able to threaten anyone again." Mabel clenched her fists. "I know where they do business. But it's dangerous." James smirked. "Good. Then they won't expect us." A plan began to form. Mabel would pretend to return to the criminals, pretending she had changed her mind. James and Theo would hide nearby, ready to listen and gather evidence. If they succeeded, the whole village would finally see who the real criminals were. If they failed, Mabel didn't want to think about that. The following night, Mabel made her way to the abandoned hut by the river. It was where the debt collectors met to count their earnings from cheating and blackmailing people. Her heart pounded as she knocked on the wooden door. A moment later, the tall debt collector opened it, eyeing her suspiciously. "Changed your mind?" Mabel forced a smile. "I realized I was stupid to fight you." He smirked and stepped aside, letting her in. The air inside was thick with the smell of old wood and burning tobacco. Several men sat around a table, counting money. The leader, a man with a scar on his cheek, leaned back in his chair. "I knew you'd come back." Mabel sat across from him. "I just want to survive." He laughed. "Smart girl. Now, let's talk business." As he spoke, Mabel subtly shifted her body to block the small gap in the wooden wall, where James and Theo were hiding outside, listening to every word. The trap was set. Now, they just had to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Mabel kept her expression neutral as the men discussed their next move. The leader, a man called Dogo, leaned forward, tapping his fingers on the wooden table. "We've got a few more debts to collect," he said. "One of the old widows near the market. She's sitting on land worth a fortune. We'll scare her into handing it over." Mabel's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to nod. "And if she refuses?" Dogo smirked. "Then we make her life miserable. Fake accusations, threats. If she's stubborn, we'll have her thrown out." Mabel clenched her fists under the table. These men had done this before. She had helped them do it. She stole a glance at the small gap in the wall. James and Theo were out there, listening to everything. If they had heard enough, they would go to the elders and expose these criminals before they could strike again. But before she could breathe a sigh of relief, one of the men narrowed his eyes at her. "You sure we can trust you, Mabel?" he asked. "You ran off once." Dogo's smirk faded. "That's true. And now you come crawling back? Why should I believe you?" Mabel's heart pounded. She had to think fast. She let out a bitter laugh. "Because I have nothing left. The village already hates me. My family has abandoned me. You're the only ones I have." Dogo studied her, then leaned back. "Fine. But one wrong move, and you won't like what happens next." Mabel forced a smile. "I understand." Outside, the shadows shifted. James and Theo were gone. The evidence had been gathered. Now, it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. The next morning, the village square was filled with murmurs. People gathered in groups, whispering among themselves. Something was happening. Mabel stood near the well, pretending to be unaware. She spotted James and Theo near the elder's hut, speaking in hushed voices. Then, Chief Okoro, the village elder, stepped forward and raised his hand for silence. "We have received disturbing information about certain individuals who have been preying on the weak," he announced. "These men have been blackmailing, stealing, and threatening our people." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Dogo and his men, who had been standing near the market, stiffened. James stepped forward. "Last night, we heard them planning to steal from an innocent widow. They admitted to false accusations, to scaring people into giving them land and money." Mabel held her breath as the crowd turned toward the criminals. One of the elders spoke. "Do you deny these accusations?" Dogo's face darkened. He looked around, realizing the crowd was against him. Then, in a flash, he turned and bolted. The other men followed, but the villagers were faster. A group of young men tackled them before they could escape. The criminals were dragged before the elders, their fates now sealed. Mabel exhaled slowly. It was over. But as she looked around at the faces of the villagers, she realized her own battle wasn't. They had exposed the criminals. But had she truly earned forgiveness? Mabel stood frozen as the villagers cheered. Dogo and his men were bound and taken away, their reign of fear finally over. But while the village rejoiced, she felt no relief. She could still feel their eyes on her. Whispered voices carried her name in the wind. She was one of them. She helped those criminals for years. Can we really trust her? Mabel lowered her gaze. She had played her part in the lies and the threats. Now, even though she had helped bring Dogo down, it didn't erase the past. James approached, his face unreadable. It's done, he said. But you know this isn't the end. Mabel nodded. I know. Chief Okoro turned toward her. Mabel, you have done the right thing today. But trust, once broken, is not easily rebuilt. She swallowed hard. What must I do? The chief looked around at the people. You must prove yourself. Not with words, but with actions. The choice is yours. Mabel knew he was right. She had betrayed their trust for too long. But was redemption even possible? She had to find out. Mabel spent the next few days in deep thought. She knew she couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, she could change what came next. She woke before sunrise, heading straight to the market to help set up stalls. The same vendors she once helped extort now eyed her warily, but she ignored their stares and worked in silence. She went to the widow whom Dogo had targeted and repaired her fence, even when the old woman refused to acknowledge her presence. She swept the village square, helped gather firewood for the elderly, and assisted the women in the fields. Still, no one spoke to her. One evening, Theo approached her as she scrubbed the temple steps. Why are you doing this? Mabel kept her head down. Because it's the right thing to do. Theo sighed. You know they might never forgive you. I know, she said, gripping the brush tighter. But I have to try. Theo was silent for a long moment. Then, without another word, he picked up a brush and began scrubbing beside her. And for the first time in years, Mabel felt like she wasn't alone. Mabel continued her quiet efforts, working from dawn till dusk, hoping that her actions would speak louder than her past mistakes. The village remained cautious, their trust slow to return. But she kept going. One afternoon, as she fetched water from the well, she noticed a small girl struggling to lift a heavy pot. Without hesitation, Mabel stepped in and helped. The girl's mother, who had been watching, hesitated before muttering a quiet, "Thank you." It was the first kind word Mabel had heard in weeks. Later that evening, as she prepared to leave the market, an elderly woman called out to her. "Mabel, take this," she said, holding out a small bag of corn. Mabel's eyes widened. "For me?" The woman nodded. "You've been working hard. I see it." Tears pricked Mabel's eyes as she accepted the gift. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. Change was coming. Slowly but surely, Mabel's efforts continued, and soon, more people began to acknowledge her presence. One morning, she found herself at the riverbank, washing clothes alongside the village women. The usual silence surrounded her, but she kept working, refusing to let their coldness break her resolve. Then, without warning, a voice spoke. "You missed a spot." Mabel turned to see Amina, one of the younger women, pointing at a stain on the fabric. Mabel blinked, then nodded. "Thank you." Amina hesitated, then handed her some soap. "Use this." Mabel accepted it cautiously. It was a small sign of acceptance, but it felt like a mountain had moved. As the sun set that evening, Mabel sat outside her hut, deep in thought. She was no longer the girl who had once lived off greed and lies. But was she truly ready for what lay ahead? Just as Mabel began to feel the first traces of acceptance, a voice from the past returned to haunt her. One evening, as she carried firewood through the village, she heard hushed whispers behind her. "She's only pretending. She thinks a few good deeds will erase everything. People like her never change." Mabel clenched her jaw and kept walking, but the words stung like 1,000 needles. Later that night, as she sat outside her hut, Theo approached. He had heard the rumors too. "You can't control what they think," he said, sitting beside her. "I know," Mabel replied, staring at the stars. "But I want to prove them wrong." Theo sighed. "Then stop waiting for them to see it. Just live it." Mabel nodded, but deep inside she wondered, would they ever truly forgive her? The next morning, chaos erupted in the village. A thief had stolen from the market, vanishing into the forest before anyone could catch him. Accusations flew, and before Mabel could react, all eyes turned to her. "She used to be one of them," a man muttered. "She's the only one desperate enough," another added. Mabel felt her stomach drop. "I didn't do it," she said, her voice steady. But the doubt in their eyes was clear. Then, to her surprise, Amina stepped forward. "Mabel was with us at the river when the theft happened." Theo crossed his arms. and I saw her working in the fields after that." A tense silence followed. Chief Okoro studied Mabel for a long moment before speaking. "This time, she is not guilty." Relief flooded through her, but so did something else: gratitude. For the first time, someone had defended her. Maybe, just maybe, trust was beginning to return. Days passed, and Mabel's efforts continued. But just when she thought she was finally earning the village's trust, a ghost from her past returned. Late one evening, as she walked home from the river, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Bola, one of Dogo's old men. Mabel froze. She hadn't seen him since Dogo's downfall. "Look at you," Bola sneered. "Playing the good girl now?" Mabel stayed silent, gripping the water pot in her hands. Bola chuckled. "You think these people will ever truly accept you? They haven't forgotten what you did." "I'm not that person anymore," Mabel said firmly. Bola leaned closer. "Then why not prove it? Help me with something. One last time." Mabel's stomach twisted. "I won't be part of anything criminal." Bola smirked. "Who said anything about crime? Just a little favor. Help me get something from the chief's hut, and I promise no one will know." Mabel's hands trembled. Bola wasn't just testing her, he was threatening her. If she refused, he might expose all her past secrets. But if she agreed, everything she had worked for would be destroyed. Mabel took a deep breath. "No." Bola's eyes darkened. "You'll regret this." He disappeared into the night, leaving Mabel shaken. She had chosen the right path. But now, danger was lurking in the shadows once again. Mabel barely slept that night. Bola's words echoed in her mind. "You'll regret this." By morning, she was exhausted but determined. She had spent too long rebuilding herself to be dragged back into the darkness. But Bola wasn't done with her yet. As she stepped out of her hut, she found a small note pinned to her door. "If you don't help me, I'll tell everyone what you did to your brothers. Let's see if they still trust you then." Mabel's heart pounded. She clenched the paper in her fist. Bola wasn't just threatening her. He was trying to destroy everything she had built. That evening, as she sat by the fire, Theo approached. He noticed the tension in her face. "What's wrong?" he asked. Mabel hesitated. Could she trust him with the truth? She took a deep breath. "Someone from my past is trying to blackmail me." Theo's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Mabel shook her head. "It doesn't matter. I won't let him win." Theo studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Then let's make sure he doesn't." Mabel's chest tightened. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't facing her battles alone. But she knew Bola wouldn't give up easily. The real fight was just beginning. Mabel knew Bola wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. If she ignored him, he would spread lies. If she gave in, she would lose everything. There was only one option left. She had to expose him first. That night, she met with Theo in secret. "We need proof," she whispered. "Something to show the chief before Bola can act." Theo nodded. "We'll set a trap." The plan was simple. Mabel would pretend to agree to Bola's demands, but Theo and a few trusted elders would be hiding nearby, listening to every word. The next evening, Mabel found Bola waiting in the shadows near the chief's compound. "So, you've come to your senses," he smirked. Mabel swallowed her fear and nodded. "What do you want me to do?" Bola leaned in. "Inside the chief's hut, there's a small wooden box. It holds important land documents. Get it for me." Mabel gasped. "You want me to steal from the chief?" "Don't act shocked," Bola sneered. "You've done worse before." Mabel's fists clenched, but she forced herself to stay calm. "And if I don't?" Bola's smile turned cruel. "Then I tell the whole village how you tricked your family, how you ruined your brothers' lives. Let's see if they still believe in your redemption then." A rustling sound came from behind the trees. Theo and the elders stepped out, their faces filled with anger and disappointment. Bola's smirk vanished. "You won't be telling anyone anything," Theo said coldly. Mabel crossed her arms. "Because this time, you're the one caught." Bola tried to run, but the elders grabbed him before he could escape. The trap had worked. But Mabel knew the battle wasn't over yet. Tomorrow, Bola would face the chief. and the whole village would finally hear the truth. The next morning, the entire village gathered in the central square. Word had spread that Bala had been caught, and people whispered anxiously about what would happen next. Chief Koma sat on his wooden throne, his expression unreadable. To his left stood Theo and the elders. To his right stood Mabel, her hands clenched at her sides. Bala knelt before them, his face pale but defiant. "Tell me, Bala," the chief said sternly. "Why did you try to force Mabel into stealing from me?" Bala scoffed. "She's no better than me. She was a liar, a manipulator. She only changed because she got caught." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mabel felt the weight of 100 eyes on her. Chief Koma turned to her. "Is that true?" Mabel took a deep breath. "Yes," she admitted. "I made terrible mistakes. I hurt my own family, and I betrayed the people who loved me. But I refused to keep being that person." Bala, on the other hand, hasn't changed. He only seeks to destroy. The chief nodded. "And do you have proof of his wrongdoing?" Theo stepped forward, holding a small leather pouch. Inside this pouch is the recording of Bala admitting his crimes. Another wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. The chief listened carefully as Theo played the evidence. Bala's voice rang out clear as day. "If you don't help me, I'll tell everyone what you did to your brothers. Let's see if they still trust you then." The chief's face hardened. He stood. "Bala, for attempting to manipulate and steal from your own people, you are hereby banished from this village." A collective gasp filled the air. Bala's eyes widened. "No, you can't do this." Two guards stepped forward, grabbing him firmly. "You were given chances to change, Bala," the chief said. "But instead, you chose deceit." Bala struggled, but it was no use. He was dragged away, his shouts fading as he disappeared from sight. Mabel let out a shaky breath. It was finally over. Or so she thought. Even with Bala gone, Mabel couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered in her heart. She had won, but at what cost? As she walked through the village later that evening, she overheard whispers. She did the right thing. But can she really be trusted? Once a snake, always a snake. Mabel clenched her fists. No matter how hard she tried, her past still haunted her. That night, Theo visited her hut. "You need to stop listening to them," he said firmly. Mabel sighed. "I just want to be free from my past." Theo smiled. "Then prove them wrong, not with words but with actions." Mabel nodded. He was right. If she wanted true redemption, she had to earn it. And she would. Over the next few weeks, Mabel dedicated herself to the village. She helped rebuild the broken well, taught young girls how to read, and assisted the farmers during harvest. Slowly, the whispers faded. One day, an elderly woman approached her. "I was wrong about you," she admitted. "You truly have changed." Mabel's heart swelled with gratitude. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. Just when things were finally settling down, an unexpected visitor arrived in the village. It was her cousin, Daniel. Mabel's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen him since she betrayed him all those years ago. "Daniel," she whispered. He looked at her for a long time before speaking. "I heard what you've been doing. Is it true?" Mabel swallowed hard. "Yes, I've changed." Daniel studied her face, searching for any signs of deception. Finally, he sighed. "Then prove it to me." Daniel didn't make it easy for her. He watched her closely, questioning everything she did. One day, he followed her to the farm. "Why are you doing this, Mabel?" he asked. "What do you want?" Mabel wiped sweat from her forehead. "Nothing," she said honestly. "I just want to do the right thing." Daniel didn't reply, but something in his eyes softened. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe her. One evening, as the sun set over the village, Daniel finally spoke. "I forgive you, Mabel." Tears welled in her eyes. "You do?" He nodded. "But forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It's up to you to never go back to who you were." Mabel understood. She would spend the rest of her life proving that she was no longer the selfish girl she once was. Just when Mabel thought her redemption was complete, life tested again. A wealthy trader came to the village, offering her a way out: gold, a luxurious home, and a fresh start in the city. All she had to do was leave everything behind. For a brief moment, old desires stirred inside her. But then she looked at her people, her family, her village, her new life. And she smiled. No amount of gold can replace what I have here. The trader left, disappointed. Mabel had passed the test. Years later, Mabel, now a respected woman and a role model for young girls. She had once been selfish and greedy, but she had learned that true wealth wasn't in gold or property. It was in love, trust, and redemption. As she watched the sunset, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had finally become the woman she was meant to be. And for the first time in her life, she was truly free. Morals of the story: redemption is possible, but it must be earned. Toxic behaviors may be normalized by society, but it is never too late to change and become a better person. Truth always prevails. Lies may seem like an easy way to success, but they will eventually be exposed. Greed leads to destruction. Selfishness and deception can ruin lives and relationships. Redemption is earned, not given. Changing one's ways requires time, effort, and proof of sincerity. Karma is real. Those who deceive and manipulate others will eventually face the consequences of their actions. Men must speak up. This story teaches men to fight back against false accusations and manipulations. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, and share this video to spread its powerful lessons. Please comment below, do you believe people can truly change?